I have a weird love-hate relationship with Assassin's Creed Odyssey. On one hand, there is a lot to love, like a stunning world, freedom to play how you want, ancient Greece, and just a fun experience overall. I've even made a video expressing how I felt like this game was underrated in a sense. Not that it was an amazing game, but more so how it was my comfort game, even for all the wrong reasons. However, there's plenty of downsides too, enough to count on both hands. It's part of an ongoing franchise, but somehow it just doesn't seem to fit in. Now let me get this out the way. This video is not me saying this game sucks. I'm just pointing out the negatives, because believe it or not, every game has its negatives. Even a masterpiece like The Witcher 3, which I class as my favorite game of all time. In fact, I plan to make the complete opposite of this video too by going over the great things about Assassin's Creed Odyssey. If you want to see me talk about my true feelings for this game, then check out my review I made for it, which surprisingly did quite well. Now recently I asked you all in a community post, if you dislike Odyssey, tell me why. The response was overwhelming, tons of comments, all with varied opinions. Most of the comments I saw talked about how it did not fit within the franchise, or perhaps how there was no hidden blade, or how grindy it felt and whatnot. Now that's exactly what I want to do in this video. I want to explore what makes this game so divisive and disliked to a majority of people. I want to go over a lot of the negatives. Now before I get into it, I'm doing a giveaway for Assassin's Creed Shadows, so look in the description to see how to enter it. And also let me know down below what your thoughts are with Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Are you a fan of it or are you not? Anyway, without further ado, let's get right into it. Now, I want to start this video by talking about something that seems to not really make a lot of sense. Well, that's the way I see it. So imagine this. We have Assassin's Creed Syndicate, right? Set in the 19th century. It's the closest the mainline games have ever come to the modern times. Fast forward 2 years and we get Assassin's Creed Origins, which catapults us back to 49 BC. Can you see where I'm trying to get at here? We went from almost modern day back to ancient times, where we got to see the birth of the Hidden Ones, which was such a cool concept. Now here's what I'm scratching my head. Why would Ubisoft decide to go even further back in time with the next game, straight after showing us the birth of the Hidden Ones? To me, that just doesn't add up. But let's be honest for a second. We all know Assassin's Creed Odyssey doesn't quite mesh with the whole Assassin's Creed name, and I know a lot of people are sick of hearing that. But it feels more like Ubisoft really wanted to dive into making an ancient Greek fantasy RPG, but then figured slapping the Assassin's Creed name on it would sell better. So what they did was put together a game focusing on the ezio lore of the franchise, which I don't really mind. The ezio goes way back, like thousands and thousands of years, and you can still manage to write a narrative about characters running into artifacts or places from that time. It's not a bad thing, it's just a very obvious case that Ubisoft jumped the gun here, banking on the fact that it would sell well. And sell well it did, because goddamn, over 10 million copies is pretty impressive. Okay, now moving away from the pre-release aspect of Odyssey, what I want to dive into now is some parts of Assassin's Creed Odyssey that I think a lot of people will relate to what I'm about to say. The first thing is mocap, because the fact that this game had very little or no mocap at all meant some pretty bad things, because Valhalla barely had mocap, Mirage barely had mocap, and God forbid I hope Assassin's Creed Shadows has mocap. Now if you don't know, motion capture or mocap involves recording the movements of real actors to create highly realistic and fluid character animations in the game. It's a technology that brings a distinct level of realism and emotional expression to characters, which for me enhances the storytelling experience of a game. Just imagine if a game like The Last of Us had Odyssey's mocap. That emotional connection we already have with Joel would not hit the same, simply because we look at him as robotic, and that's exactly how I look at the characters in Assassin's Creed Odyssey. But to be honest, we can all blame that on Serge Haskell. He's the one who supposedly said Ubisoft's games has too many cutscenes, which bumped up the production costs. Thankfully he's not around anymore, because that guy. If you know his story, then that's all I will say. You know, playing Odyssey and then Valhalla back to back and then hopping back to Origins really puts into perspective about how the animation quality dipped. In Assassin's Creed Origins, it feels like they use motion capture for nearly all of the story cutscenes, you can really tell, but in the 2 games after, I could probably count on one hand the cutscenes that seem mocap. Another similar concept to mocap is the cinematic trailer for Assassin's Creed Odyssey, or lack thereof. This game went a completely different route in its marketing by not releasing a cinematic trailer at all, which is actually a first for the series. Usually these cinematic trailers are pretty important for Assassin's Creed games. They give us a sneak peek that's not just cool to look at, but also sets up the story and the vibe of the game. These trailers really help ramp up the excitement and show what the game is all about artistically and narratively. But now, let's shift our focus to the gameplay and design choices in Assassin's Creed Odyssey. This is where things start to get a bit contentious. Unlike previous games in the franchise, Odyssey takes a more RPG-driven approach. Yes, Origins is somehow classed as an RPG game, but then again, the term RPG has lost its original meaning over the years, so I wouldn't really pay too much attention to that. Anyway, Odyssey had a very heavy emphasis on leveling, skill trees, and grinding for gear, elements that were only lightly touched upon in earlier games. Now, some of you watching would appreciate this deeper RPG integration, seeing it as a fresh evolution of the franchise, which I agree. I mean, Assassin's Creed Shadows seems like it's going to be even more of a fresh evolution, and I'm all for it. However, other people feel it strays too far from the roots of the series, turning into what some might call a generic open world RPG. And then there's the massive size of the game. Odyssey has one of the biggest worlds in the series, full of cities, oceans, and mountains. It looks incredible, but I can see it being pretty overwhelming too. There's just so many side quests, and honestly, a lot of them are filler. If you compare it to Origins, there's definitely a stark contrast in writing, especially for side quests. Odyssey is definitely a case of quantity over quality. This abundance of quests can water down the story quite a bit, especially if you're somebody who likes a more straightforward plot. So you've got one set of players who love exploring this huge sprawling world, and then you have the other set of players who really miss the more focused, tight-knit stories from the earlier games. Now here's my question to you. Do you prefer smaller scale cities like Venice, Florence, or Paris? Or do you prefer large scaled worlds like Origins and Odyssey? Now, staying on the topic of gameplay, let's talk about the combat side of the game, but more specifically the enemies that we'd fight. When you play through Odyssey, you definitely notice that something else stands out. The enemies can feel really tanky. It's like no matter how much you attack them, they just soak up damage. This definitely changes up the combat dynamics compared to something like Origins, where enemies felt a bit more manageable. In a game like Odyssey, you often end up in these prolonged battles that test your patience as much as your skill. It's a shift that not everyone is a fan of, since it can make fights feel less about strategy and more about endurance. If you want enemies to feel less tanky in the game, you're going to need to put some time into grinding levels and upgrading your gear. This means tackling more quests, defeating more enemies, and completing certain challenges to gain experience and resources necessary for those crucial upgrades. It's a bit of a grind, but as you level up and improve your gear, you'll start to notice that previously tough enemies start to go down a bit easier. So the best tip I can give you is just keep at it, and you'll definitely see the difference in damage over time. Now, another certain aspect of enemies I want to go over is mercenaries. Now, mercenaries are not everybody's cup of tea, and are one of the major reasons why this game is so divisive. You see, the presence of mercenaries can really test your patience. It feels like they're just about everywhere, and their constant interference becomes quite tedious. No matter how stealthily you move or where you hide, it seems like a mercenary will eventually show up and start patrolling your area. Now, I can see how this disrupts gameplay, and even forces you to either pay off your bounty or just wait it out. But it also breaks the immersion. It's as if they have some kind of supernatural ability to pinpoint your location without any logical reason, like they're somehow getting instant messages about your whereabouts. But then again, does immersion really play a part in this game? I wouldn't be surprised if somehow, some way these mercenaries were sent by the ezio or some shit like that. The mercenary system at first seems amazing with its bounty hunters and tier system, but the charm wears off pretty quickly, especially when they start becoming a flea in your exploration. You could be deep into a story mission, trying to complete objectives unseen, and suddenly 2 or 3 mercenaries are just teleported in. It gets frustrating because they not only disrupt the mission, but they also attract attention of other enemies, making it harder to stay under the radar. Another pretty disappointing feature I've been seeing in the comments section is the Conquest System. Now, the Conquest System can feel pretty mediocre and kind of a letdown. A lot of players, myself included, find the Conquest battles not that fun. The loot is alright, but who controls a region doesn't really change much in the game. The battles just repeat themselves and don't really seem to push the main story forward. Basically, picking a side in the war feels more like a cosmetic choice than anything that genuinely affects the outcome of the game, which really pulls away from feeling like your choices matter in these big conflicts. Also, the random chances of bumping into goddamn mercenaries with specific strengths and weaknesses can be more annoying than exciting. Running into a merc with the brawler strength who shrugs off melee attacks can be super frustrating. Sure, axes and maces with their big knockout moves can make a difference, but it often feels more about what gear and abilities you have rather than your actual skill or strategy. I think the Conquest System could have been way more engaging if it had more strategic elements and actually made a difference in the game's world and storyline. Another thing worth mentioning is how the game handles gear. There's this ongoing cycle of constantly swapping out your equipment as you level up. It almost feels like you're forever chasing the next best piece of gear. As you make your way through the game, you keep running into better gear than what you've currently got. This makes it feel almost pointless to sink a lot of resources into upgrading or engraving your current items, especially since it seems like you'll just end up replacing them soon after. It's a common frustration among players, constantly having to tweak your loadouts to meet the growing challenges and demands of new levels and missions. You pretty much end up always wondering whether to spend spend those valuable resources on upgrades or to save them. Now, this criticism does not really bother me if I'm being honest, but I still need to address it, especially since it's a major talking point when looking at the negatives for Assassin's Creed Odyssey. So you'll notice that there's no hidden blade, and that's thrown off a lot of people, especially those really into the series' traditional style. Instead, we get to wield the Spear of Leonidas, which to me is this cool mythical artifact that really ties into the story. The hidden blade is not just a cool weapon assassins use, it's essentially a symbol of the whole stealth and assassination gameplay that's at the heart of Assassin's Creed. But Odyssey takes a different path. It's set in a time before the Assassin Brotherhood or the Hidden Ones even existed. That historical context explains why the Hidden Blade is not featured. It just was not around yet according to the lore of the franchise. But then again, there's a flaw. The Hidden Blade popped up in 465 BCE when Darius used it to take out the Persian king Xerxes, whereas the main story of Assassin's Creed Odyssey is set in 431 BCE, which means the Hidden Blade was definitely around during that time. So it kind of makes you wonder why they decided to leave it out of the game entirely. Okay, so that's probably enough about the gameplay side of Assassin's Creed Odyssey for now. There is a lot more we could get into, but let's not drag that out. What I really want to dive into next is Cassandra and the story and how it wraps up. Now, I've come across a video and some Reddit posts, I know Reddit, debating whether Cassandra should be the canon choice. And honestly, there's some merit to that discussion. Just to be clear, I personally prefer Cassandra over Alexios by far. The way she's voiced, her portrayal, and just her overall character really pulls me in a lot more than Alexios does. So I'm definitely not saying she's the lesser of the two. Anyway, during the story of Assassin's Creed Odyssey, there's a point where you're now entering the Olympics, and if you're playing as Alexios or Cassandra, you're given the mission to escort Sparta's champion to the Olympics. However, due to some unexpected twists, the champion dies, and your character ends up taking his place in the Pancration event. Now, if you're playing as Alexios, this makes a lot of sense, but there's a slight issue. So there's a side quest where a woman is almost executed for just watching the Olympics, and it makes you wonder, how would Cassandra even be able to compete in the Olympics when other women are not allowed to even watch? Historically, women could not compete in events like Pancration, or however you pronounce it. So realistically, Cassandra would not be able to step in as the champion either. The game briefly touches on this with a generic comment about the situation being unprecedented, regardless of whether you're playing as Alexios or Cassandra. Now, there is a few answers. The first one is it's just a game, and there's really not much to think about. The second answer is Cassandra was not married at the time. The problem is, in the side quest where the woman got in trouble for watching the Olympics, well, in truth, it was not just that she was a woman, it was that she was a married woman, widowed, but still considered married. The big issue for the priestess about the married woman watching the games was the fear that she'd be staring at the oily, muscled athletes competing. Now, if Cassandra were caught doing the same, well, she's an unmarried woman. At best, you could say that this is a pretty messy take on the real events, considering they're working with faulty DNA and the Animus is just filling in the gaps in the genetic memories where things really might not add up. But honestly, it all boils down to some pretty sloppy writing from Ubisoft. It's all just fiction and should not be taken as anything more. As far as a lot of people are concerned, there is no definitive canon, just a bunch of different versions that kind of work if you just don't overthink it. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is more of a problem that I have with this game. Now, despite how good looking the world is and how comforting this game is, the story is the main problem for me. I've said this in my Odyssey review, it's just not a great story. But I want to focus on the ending, which is where the real problem is. Now, for me, the ending was a major letdown. The story tries to reunite you with your family members at different points, and depending on how you handle those interactions, they might end up surviving or dying because of your choices, leading to some sort of family reunion at the end. But honestly, those moments don't really hit hard or feel important. Most of the time, the interactions with them just feel shallow. They're either asking for help, making suggestions, or throwing around threats. I mean, I liked the game, but that ending just fell flat. The quote-unquote good ending was so underwhelming, and it felt very rushed. After all the effort I put in playing as Cassandra, trying to win Alexios back, the way it all ended just seemed too simple. Like, really? That's all it took to convince him? After I finished the story, which seemed to rush and leave a lot unresolved towards the end, I had to backtrack to side missions just to piece together what was missed. The hunt for the cultist targets, which should have been fun, just turned into a tedious grind because of the leveling system that gates off important content behind levels. I think Assassin's Creed Odyssey tried to do too much by having these separate endings for its major questlines: the cult, your family, and Atlantis. It really needed a fourth ending or an epilogue to tie everything together, which kind of happened with the Atlantis DLC, but not quite. The family ending is definitely the weakest. It's often the first one you'd come across, so it's not supposed to be the grand finale, but it's still a letdown and it just feels like it was rushed overall. Now that brings me to the end of the video. I know this video focused on the negatives, so don't worry, I will be making a video focusing on the positives. So please don't think I hate this game or I'm shitting on it when in reality I like it. Now what are your thoughts on Assassin's Creed Odyssey? I want you to be honest with your answers. Factor in the fact that at the end of the day, this is an Assassin's Creed game, and that's how a majority of fans will judge this game. If you're someone that does not care about the franchise but likes Assassin's Creed Odyssey, then fair play. I'm sure you love the game and I hope you had an amazing time. Anyway, if you did enjoy this video, be sure to hit that subscribe button, and with that said, I'll see you in the next one.